Hi everyone, my name is Hayden and today we're going to be talking about the JavaScript ecosystem. This is a fun little lecture, I think, because it really takes something that you see as very one-dimensional, which is probably JavaScript. You see it as a language that you write code and you run, and really helps break it out into its kind of different aspects in terms of, you know, what different versions of the language are there? How are they used differently? What even is a language? Because JavaScript, unlike most other things that you've dealt with, is so multi-layered. The fundamentals are used in a range of different applications, which means that there are things you can and can't do, and understanding this nuance is extremely important, I think, to getting your head around this whole crazy world that's so full of JavaScript. So, you know, the first question, what even is JavaScript? Well, it's a programming language. You probably figured that much out by now. Is it what Google Chrome has? Well, we've kind of shown that you can run JavaScript in a web browser, so I guess, is a web browser a compiler? Is it an interpreter? What even is that? What is Node.js? And, you know, we run that on the command line in the previous lecture with the syntax introduction. Does that understand JavaScript? Does that mean that the web browser is running Node.js? Does that mean that Node.js is like a web browser on the terminal? Like, these are the interesting questions, right? Is React.js different from JavaScript? We're going to cover that in week 7, so don't worry about all that stuff now. And then, like, what version am I even using? Because I've said in the previous lecture, oh, in newer versions of JavaScript, you can do this. So let's take a step back and really, you know, think about what's actually going on sometimes when it comes to just running JavaScript, right? So when I have a simple piece of code, and we've seen a simple piece of code like in the JavaScript syntax lecture, right? Where we had a simple piece of code like this. This one was for the web browser, but similarly, you know, this one you could run on Node.js. The JavaScript's still the same. What's actually going on here, right? Well, we have our language definition. This kind of is actually, let me start from the other side. We have our source code, right? That's this stuff here. That's what's written inside of text files. It's a program that we write. It's just ASCII. It's just characters, right? These are all just ASCII characters. Great. The two questions: how does this turn into running stuff on computers? And then why did we write this? So to answer that second question, why do we write this, that comes back to the language definition. And a language is honestly just a set of rules that someone writes in a book. You don't need a compiler to have a language. You could go and write your own programming language that couldn't actually run, because a language is just a set of rules. You know, if statements this, you can do that, you can not do that. If you don't like a language like C, you could go and write a language called D, and you could go and add a couple of features if you wanted to. And that could be your own language. You don't need a compiler, but that's like a language definition. Typically, language definitions, there's like one of these things. So like, you know, there's like the JavaScript language. It's not really like a thing where different countries or different web browsers think JavaScript is like different. Everyone kind of agrees on what the language is. And then those languages are kind of released in various versions. So there's like an international community, say, for JavaScript, where they sit around and they say, okay, this is what JavaScript is, and we want to add this to JavaScript, and then they all agree, and then they're like, this is the new version of JavaScript, the language. What then happens separate, well, often it's, you know, they're very closely coupled, but what happens, like, to think separately is that then people go and create compilers or interpreters that take the source code that you wrote, and you wrote it based off the language definition, and they turn it into like runnable code, and they do that by building a compiler or an interpreter. And you're pretty used to these, right? Python 3, Node in the previous lecture, GCC for C. These are all just programs that fundamentally take source code, ASCII text, and they follow the language rules, and they produce that, you know, runnable code. So compilers are based on these language rules. Where this helps take us in our understanding, right? That's just the summary of it. Where this helps take us in our understanding is, now let's apply this to JavaScript. So we understand source code. There's going to be nothing we need to talk about there, right? Source code is the .js files that we write, like this one here. The language definition is a bit more interesting though. We've just been referring to this as JavaScript at the moment, but more formally, JavaScript is known as Ecmascript, which is often shortened to ES for Ecmascript. Ecmascript is the actual language that we use. You know, if you were to Google right now, what is the difference between JavaScript and Ecmascript, you would get something that's like, there's not that much of a difference. Ecmascript is the standard for scripting languages such as JavaScript, etc. You know, JavaScript is a language based on Ecmascript, and like this is kind of true, right? Like JavaScript is essentially an implementation of Ecmascript, if you will. But like I don't want to get too much into the semantic, partly because I'll get it wrong, but also because it doesn't really matter. JavaScript and Ecmascript, think of them like the same thing for the purposes of introduction to the concepts. The reason that we're telling you about Ecmascript, though, is because it's actually around a lot on the internet. You'll actually see a lot of references to it, so you need to understand that it's the same thing. JavaScript or Ecmascript, same thing, first appeared in 1997. That's when we started to see JavaScript. Since then, there have been more and more releases of like newer and newer language definitions of JavaScript, Ecmascript, but for a long time it was fairly similar. The amount of updates have dramatically increased ever since web's become a lot more popular. In fact, some of the key ones are definitely ES5 and ES6. You'll actually see these terms thrown around a little bit on articles and other things. Like when you go look at, when was JavaScript classes introduced? I mentioned before that classes were a new feature in JavaScript. And like you can see it here, what are classes in JavaScript? Classes were introduced in Ecmascript 2015 ES6. Okay. So you see all these like different versions, right, of JavaScript. So it's like ES5, ES6 were two big ones, and then after that they started doing it by a year. So they called it Ecmascript 2016, 2017, etc. You can go and read this if you'd like to. JavaScript, all these things, where are we at ES10? But to bring it all back, Ecmascript is the language we're writing. Like it's what defines the language, and there are different versions of that language. And most of what we use with JavaScript are all kind of oldish features. In fact, in the last lecture, pretty much nearly everything that I showed you was quite old feature of JavaScript, except for classes. So that's the language, okay? That's probably not too crazy. Things get a little bit more complicated on the like compiler or interpreter side of things. And the reason for that is because the compiler or interpreter is made up of an Ecmascript engine and a runtime environment. An Ecmascript engine is the thing that actually understands the JavaScript, right? It can turn if statements into logic branches and interpret strings and casts and booleans. Like it's kind of the fundamentals. Like Ecmascript is basically what the Ecmascript engine is essentially what the introduction to JavaScript was about. Runtime environments, though, are like a layer on top of that takes this engine and allows you to run it in certain environments. So, a web browser is a runtime environment. Node.js is a runtime environment, and they are both, or can be, built off the same Ecmascript engine. So this starts to get into the subtlety between it. So if you think about the web browser as a compiler or interpreter, and Node.js, the command line, remember Node.js is this command line that we were doing stuff on in the previous lecture, and the web browser is the web browser, they are both two different runtime environments. And they use the exact same, well, I think in this case they do, but they don't always have to. They use a Ecmascript engine underneath. So runtime environments like the browser or Node.js are built on top of these engines, which are engines that interpret the language and produce runnable code. What these engines don't have is what you would call an API or an input-output layer. And what that means is that when it comes to the web browser, web browsers have a bunch of stuff that allow you to interact with the JavaScript, and Node.js has a bunch of stuff that allows you to interact with it, and they're both very different. There's some code that you can write in Node.js that you can't write on the browser, and we'll do a couple of examples of those. So if we dig even deeper into this and we start looking at some examples, you can see there are these different Ecmascript language versions, ES 2009 or ES5, ES6 2015, ES7, etc. Then you have different Ecmascript engines. The most popular one is the Google V8 engine. That's what Chrome is running off. That is what Node.js is running off. And then you have the runtime environments. And different browsers are different runtime environments. So you can see here that Safari is actually like its own interpreter, different runtime environment, built off JS Core Nitro, which is a different Ecmascript engine. In reality, the engine is kind of all the same. Like, it's not something that you have to be personally concerned about. You're often going to be more interested in the runtime environment. And as you can see here, each version of a runtime environment is built off a particular version of an Ecmascript engine, and each version of an Ecmascript engine is built to a particular version of Ecmascript. So basically, a new version of Ecmascript comes out. People who write these Ecmascript engines go and update them to have newer features like classes, and then people like who run Node.js and Chrome, they go and take those newer ones and integrate them in as well. But the language, like these two things, are quite tightly coupled together fundamentally. Now, the next two slides are just to compare Google and it's to talk about Google's V8 engine and then Node.js and then the browser. So let's talk about the Ecmascript engine. Google's V8 engine is an open source JavaScript execution engine. It's part of the Chromium project, etc. Essentially, it is a standalone system that can interpret Ecmascript, and it can be built into any kind of C++ application or a whole bunch of other things. It's very low level, and its sole job is to parse, interpret, and execute, and compile JavaScript. So if you look at the structure of the V8 engine, it's quite literally something that parses, interprets source code, generates bytecode to run, and kind of runs it. That's really it. Like, it's very low level. It's quite literally there to just to do the hard yards of, the adding and subtracting and function calls and function stack. Like, when you think about all those things, right? Function calls, function stacks, if statements, conditions, like all of this is handled by the engine. Where Node.js, the runtime environment, sits above it, and you can see on the diagram here that it's using V8 as part of it, it's a JavaScript runtime with an easy-to-use command line capability that's built on top of Chrome's V8 engine. So when I said before that a runtime environment has an API or an input-output layer, you might have been thinking, I don't know what that means. But think about it, it's the command line. Like, how did we interact with Node.js before? We ran something on the command line. It's taking in these commands. It's actually running on the CLI. So that's where that I/O is, which is kind of interesting. And you can see that here is like, you got your V8 engine and it's interacting with like our application. Like, we're running some code. It's got some bindings to all this other crazy stuff here. It's like event loop, event queue, threads. We're going to talk more about what that is soon. But essentially, it's trying to demonstrate to you that some of the other features that you'll see, and you'll see this in the Node lecture, are can only work with Node.js. Like file system, for instance, which is very interesting. And we'll talk about it in a sec. Let's jump between these two slides a little bit. So the next part is Google Chrome, right? Google Chrome itself is a runtime environment. It's much bigger though, right? Like, a browser is a big thing. It's able to interpret and render HTML and CSS, but ignoring all of this, right? So all the HTML, CSS stuff that it renders has nothing to do with the V8 engine. And you can see here that a web browser takes in HTML, and what it does is it's able to render a page. This is all the CSS parser and painting. This is all the rendering stuff that you've done in the previous lectures. But then separately to that, it actually works with the V8 engine and some other stuff built into the browser to like do some more dynamic things, right? And up until this point, you haven't really done anything with JavaScript. So let me just show you two kind of quick tastes of things with JavaScript that'll solidify the point. So as we saw in the previous lecture, we have code like this that runs in both the Node.js interpreter and inside the Google Chrome browser. Now, after this lecture, the two lectures that you're going to go and watch Doesn't have to be in this order. Are you going to go and watch the browser introduction, the JavaScript web browser introduction, and the JavaScript Node.js NPM introduction? They are both the logical splits from this lecture to go and learn a little bit more about the runtime environments. So just to really reiterate, the previous lecture with all the syntax was really learning about what's going on or what can you do with like a Ecmascript engine. And now it's like, what are these layers on top of it? So when we ran this in the browser, it was just about running, you know, some basic stuff, really basic stuff. But here's an example. On the web browser, let me just open up, just need to find where that Chrome window is. Maybe I closed it. Let me just find the file. Give me 1 second. So I have this file here from before, right? And that file was was when we had this test.html. Now, with this test.html, we were able to print some stuff to the console, right? Like that 3 there. That's what we did before. However, let me show you something. If I do console log here, window.innerWidth, this will print the width of the window, 138 pixels, right? That's 138 pixels between, you know, where my mouse is shaking here. If I make this smaller, it prints 93 if I refresh the page, right? So that JavaScript's running. Now this window.innerWidth, this window object is something that is built on top of the Ecmascript engine. And in fact, if you take that code here and you go and try and run it here, watch what happens if I open up the terminal. If I go node 0, it says window is not defined. So we're still writing JavaScript, but this is part of the layer above. That is important to distinguish. You need to understand that you're writing the same language in 2 different environments, and there are different kind of APIs and nuances between those 2 environments. Now on the flip side, let me show you something that only Node.js can do. If I type in Node.js write file, right? How do I write files in Node.js? And they'll give you some code. I want to find one that's like gonna make a bit more sense. You know, there you go. Let's go and copy and paste this. Let's get rid of this window.width. So here it's like let data equals hello. So I want to print hello to a file programming.txt. So I can like hash include or import this library called file system. We'll talk about this more in the Node lecture. I can go and create some data called hello, and then I can go and try and write that data to this file. So then if I go and open the file, node 0, it doesn't print anything, but have a look. I've got a file now, programming.txt. There's the file. So that worked. That's something that Node is able to do, right? And it's an example of like Node is set up to be able to use libraries, and those libraries are able to write to the file system. Whereas browsers, again, are very different. If I go and paste this in the browser, like that, I come back here, I get an error. This error, let me zoom in, says require is not defined. It's like, what is that? Because require is an element of the runtime environment that Node.js built on top of the Ecmascript engine. That's what's going on here. They're 2 kind of different things. Now, this is not to give you the impression that Node.js is this thing over here and the browser's over there and they're all kind of crazy different. Honestly, like, it's all very similar. There are just elements that are different. And there are also elements that are built into both Node and the browser that are built into the runtime environments but give you the same behavior. An example of that's what we'll learn in week 4 about making network requests. So you can make a network request from the web browser, and you can also make a network request from Node. You can do it from both of those things, and that doesn't mean just because you can do it in both that it's part of the Ecmascript engine. It's actually part of the runtime environment, and you can see that on the slides here. You see that in the browser, they have their networking capabilities, not part of V8, and in Node.js, the networking capabilities are also not part of V8. but the intention is to give you like a a bit more of a parity and experience. Yeah, that's about it. Again, you're going to go and learn more about this whole Node.js kind of command line code thing with JavaScript by looking at the Node npm intro lecture. We don't do a ton of this in this course. Like, honestly, this we don't go too deep into because it's pretty straightforward. To be honest, it's very similar to Python, so you kind of get it. And then the browser intro lecture that at the moment, at the time of this recording, is in week 3. It might change depending on when you're watching this recording. That's where you dig more into the browser stuff and you see more about what can the browser do and what is this DOM and various other things. Like, how does JavaScript work that's unique to the browser based on that runtime environment? So anyway, hopefully that gives some context, bit of information about the landscape, and thanks very much.